Russian army would be in Spain.
We are looking at the map of Europe. In the heart of Europe, far from the noisy streets of the cities, a silent yet massive transformation is taking place. If you have noticed, there are points appearing at various locations on the map. If you ask what these points signify, we can say that Europe is preparing for war, and with an enormous preparation reaching up to 7 million square meters. The smoke rising from factory chimneys has become not only a symbol of industrial production, but also of the spirit of rearmament across the continent. This reawakening shows that the complacency of the peace period has ended and has given way to the determination to confront geopolitical realities. This rearmament process, which quietly began in Europe, may be difficult to see with the naked eye, but it is clearly documented by satellites. The expansions have already reached 7 million square meters. In other words, the construction of industrial bases for war preparation in Europe is on the rise. In this episode of our inventory series, we examine the sites identified in Europe for war preparations. If you are ready, let's begin. The process that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 accelerated the wheels of Europe's defense industry like never before, 3 times faster in fact. The real process began right here.
Since the 1990s, the European defense and security mechanism has suffered a severe decline. Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually played the role of a reckoning for this process, serving as a trigger for its correction and revival. In the long run, in order to establish a sustainable defense industry, the pool of human resources must be expanded. It is not only about armament programs, it must also be carried out within the framework of an industrial policy.
At the beginning of the war, Western countries rapidly depleted their own weapon stockpiles to support Kyiv. However, over time it became clear that the existing production capacities were insufficient to meet the enormous ammunition demands of the front. Ukraine's daily use of tens of thousands of artillery shells painfully revealed to European leaders the inadequacy of peacetime production models. Reports sent from Ukrainian soldiers on the front line clearly demonstrated how the shortage of ammunition was affecting the course of the war. The Russian army gained a 10-to-1 superiority over Ukraine in artillery fire.
It's time to shift to a wartime mindset and to turbocharge our defensive production and our defensive spending.
This situation made it necessary for Europe to review not only its existing stockpiles, but also its long-term production capacity.
Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe.
NATO's former Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's statement that Ukraine's needs exceed our production capacity was the clearest expression of this emergency. Therefore, Europe's defense industry transformed from a non-profit support mechanism into a vital economic sector for survival and deterrence. While replacing the weapons and ammunition supplied to Ukraine with new orders, the countries on NATO's eastern flank also took steps to strengthen their own defenses. This acceleration has become the clearest evidence that a transformation long discussed but never realized has now turned into a visible reality. According to a comprehensive analysis by the Financial Times, covering 150 facilities belonging to 37 companies, the construction projects carried out in this process have expanded new production areas totaling over 7 million square meters. This enormous figure shows that Europe is rapidly transforming into an industrial base, just like in times of war. Radar data from Sentinel-1 satellites revealed that the construction area, which was 790,000 square meters in the 2020-2021 period, soared to 2.8 million square meters in 2024 to 2025. This proves that the revival of Europe's defense industry is not merely rhetoric but has taken on a concrete form. One of the biggest motivations behind this transformation is the concern that America's arms support for Ukraine may one day come to an end. Yes, it would be accurate to say that this concern has opened Europe's eyes, because Trump's statements at the time created anxiety in many European countries.
Sir, if we don't pay and we are attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay, you're delinquent. And he said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay your bills.
For years, Europe cut its defense spending and became dependent on America.
The principal guarantor of Europe's security was the United States, not only as armed forces, but the equipping of European armies, the support of defense and aviation projects in Europe, and the transfer of technology and know-how. The US was the primary source. In short, the US held the main commitments or responsibilities for European security. We have long known about the US's unease with this position. We also know that the US has, in effect, urged Europe to stand more firmly on its own feet.
Now Europe is moving toward breaking free from that dependency and toward determining its own fate. The European Union is making intense efforts to replenish its stocks and to make support for Ukraine sustainable. This effort is not only about increasing ammunition production, it also aims to strengthen supply chains and consolidate strategic autonomy. Let us examine region by region. One of the most striking of these vast projects is the rise of Germany's defense industry. Germany is the heart of European defense manufacturing. The German giant Rheinmetall stands out as one of the key actors in this transformation. The company is increasing production capacity at its Várpalota facility in Hungary, as well as at its plant in Unterlüß in northern Germany. This facility plays a critical role in the production of 155mm artillery shells and 120mm tank ammunition. Rheinmetall aims to raise annual artillery shell production to 1.1 million by 2027. It should be noted that this increase represents not only meeting Ukraine's needs but also substantially replenishing NATO stockpiles. Turning to missile production, as you know, missiles are indispensable in war. A similar surge has been observed in missile manufacturing. European missile giant MBDA has recorded a 94,000 square meter expansion at its Schrobenhausen facility in Germany since 2022. With EU support, the company plans to scale up production of shoulder-launched missiles such as the Enforcer, and the NATO order of 1,000 Patriot GEM-T missiles further multiplies its production capacity. Not only Germany but Norwegian and Finnish firms are also prominent in missile production. Nammo, operating as a Norway-Finland partnership, plays an important role in this race. It received 55 million euros in EU support, while Kongsberg is investing 640 million Norwegian kroner to build a missile factory. This map of rearmament in Europe shows that different countries are focusing on their own strategic priorities. For example, France-based Nexter stands out particularly in artillery systems and ammunition production. At Nexter's main facilities in Morges, Caesar self-propelled howitzers and their munitions are produced. The French government is making large investments in Nexter to replace the Caesars sent to Ukraine and to meet new orders. These investments are also accelerating the modernization of the French armed forces.
The important countries in Europe, those with advanced economies, industry and technology, such as Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and perhaps Italy, each have their national security and strategic priorities. We can see interesting traces of this in the armament programs launched by Germany and France in recent years. That said, one must consider these countries' priorities separately from the European Union and NATO frameworks. Of course, the United Kingdom left the EU with Brexit and pursues its national security policies independently, generally aligned with the United States. We are also seeing certain divergences between Germany and France in recent years. Germany has implemented a very significant increase in its defense budget and made a notable move by ordering F-35s from America.
A similar picture prevails in the United Kingdom. The UK's defense industry is expanding under the leadership of BAE Systems. BAE Systems' Glasgow facility in South Wales is being reconfigured with the aim of increasing explosive filling capacity by a factor of 16. Examples like this show that Europe's defense industry is not mere rhetoric, but a reality backed by concrete investments. These investments are critical for meeting NATO's rising defense expenditures and for using tax revenues effectively. One of the engines of this accelerated growth has been the EU's ASAP program. Designed with a €500 million budget to relieve bottlenecks in ammunition and missile production, the program supported 88 facilities. At 20 of them, entirely new factories and roads were built, while 14 underwent smaller-scale expansions. EU Defence Commissioner Andrius Kubilius expects Europe's overall ammunition production capacity to reach 2 million rounds by the end of the year. However, these vast figures also raise questions. After all, building factories alone is not sufficient to increase production capacity.
Even if European countries do not face severe problems in creating budgets or resources, they are likely to encounter significant difficulties in convincing European societies and publics to accept these armament programs and defense industry expenditures in securing their consent and support. Whether social support is achieved or not will very likely determine how sustainable the restructuring of Europe's defense and security industry will be.
Critical materials, skilled labor, and most importantly, supply chains for sensitive components such as small jet engines must also be robust. Encouraged by the success of ASAP, the European Commission is reportedly working on a new defense program with a $1.5 billion budget that will finance joint procurements. This program is said to cover many strategic areas, from missiles to air defense systems, from heavy weapons to unmanned aerial vehicles. Such incentives are important steps taken to revive Europe's defense industry and to strengthen its strategic independence. However, the success of this process will not be limited to financial investments alone. The fragmented structure of Europe's defense industry and each country's prioritization of its own national interests make it difficult to establish a common strategy.
Europe still remains dependent on America's various capabilities, particularly in force projection, intelligence, and air power. We have witnessed this since the mid-1990s in various operations, crises, and conflict zones starting from Bosnia. Establishing a joint military capacity, training it, and maintaining it in a constant state of combat readiness to respond immediately to security risks and crises has long been on the European Union's agenda. However, this has not yet been achieved. It seems that developing this capacity within the NATO framework by using mechanisms within NATO would be a much more realistic approach. Nevertheless, we know that debates on this matter still continue within the European Union.
Yet America, with projects like the F-35, had transformed its defense industry into a power hub by creating a massive market and a global network. The rearmament in Europe is not limited to assisting Ukraine. It also carries the aim of creating long-term deterrence against Russia. However, at this point, a serious problem emerges: long-range missiles.
Let NATO countries in Ukraine designate a target to be hit, let's say in Kiev. Let them concentrate all their air and missile defenses there. Then let us launch an Oreshnisk ballistic missile attack and see what happens.
Many experts emphasize that long-range missiles are of vital importance in countering Russia's superior land forces. According to experts, although NATO outnumbers Russia in terms of technology, military personnel, and vehicles, it may struggle to keep up with Russia's rapid mobilization. Therefore, in a possible attack, the ability to retaliate, being able to say if they attack us, we will attack them, is a fundamental prerequisite for deterrence. However, Europe's situation in this regard is not very promising. Russia is clearly ahead in long-range missiles and hypersonic weapons. In Europe, on the other hand, there is a serious bottleneck in the supply of small jet engines necessary for missile production. This stands out as a significant problem that could undermine the goal of increasing long-range missile capacity. For this reason, the European Union will likely argue that future programs should focus not only on ammunition, but also on the production of such critical components. This restructuring process is reminiscent of both Boeing's existential struggle and the outcomes of past military rivalries. Speaking of existential struggles, let us take an example from America. In the competition between the YF-22 and YF-23, America prioritized maneuverability over features such as speed and radar invisibility. This choice allowed Lockheed Martin to dominate the industry for years, while forcing the losing companies, Northrop and McDonnell Douglas, to merge or face financial hardship. This process in Europe carries a similar existential struggle for companies. Firms receiving ASAP funds are growing faster than others, showing how effectively government incentives are revitalizing the defense industry. However, this growth may not always be visible. Some companies, such as BAE Systems in the UK, are adapting their existing facilities to increase production, which does not appear as a clear expansion in satellite imagery. This proves that the policies aimed at enhancing Europe's military power are beginning to show results. Yet it is still difficult to assess the precise impact of financial incentives. Nonetheless, the momentum generated in the defense industry seems likely to contribute to the region's long-term strategic independence goals. The awakening of Europe's defense industry has the potential not only to reshape the continent's security architecture, but also to influence global power balances. These developments concern not only Europe but the entire world. This rearmament trend in Europe may also bring strategic consequences for Turkey.
I believe that in the upcoming period there are very significant, long-term and interesting cooperation opportunities in Europe and especially in the European Union for Turkey. Turkey has mature, ready-made solutions in many areas where Europe has critical needs. Moreover, the Turkish defense industry has a structure capable of producing solutions quickly, generating very dynamic solutions and moving swiftly into production. This is in fact a capacity that Europe will need. Therefore, I believe that in the coming period, very interesting steps may be taken and highly productive outcomes may emerge in defense industry cooperation between Turkey and Europe. I truly believe this.
Increasing Europe's own production capacity may reduce its future demand for Turkey's defense products. However, this could also create new cooperation opportunities for Turkey. For example, collaborations like Baykar-Leonardo. It would not be wrong to say that Europe's bottleneck in jet engine supply could become new markets for Turkish engine manufacturers such as TEI. Furthermore, Turkey's projects such as Kaan, Akıncı, and Kızıl Elma are being followed with interest by European military officials. In particular, the concept of manned and unmanned systems operating together is of vital importance for Europe's future war scenarios. This means that Turkey's experience and technological expertise in this field represent potential collaborations it could offer to Europe.
It is not very realistic for Europe to reach a production capacity on the scale of Russia in the short or medium term. However, it is at least theoretically possible for it to increase capacity very rapidly. Here, Turkey could actually be a very serious resource. This could already be an important area of cooperation between Turkey and Europe. With properly managed investments, I would expect Europe to rapidly achieve a considerable capacity. Still, it will not immediately reach a production capacity on the scale of Russia or China.
In conclusion, this awakening in Europe's defense industry is reshaping the continent's security architecture. However, this process is still in its early stages. Will this major transformation bring Europe to a stronger position against Russia? Or will these investments only provide short-term solutions? And most importantly, what new opportunities might this restructuring process create for Turkey's defense industry and regional position? All of this remains a matter of curiosity. But one thing is certain: Europe is